reading from the letters to the Hebrews, chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, and verses 8 through 16. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith, our ancestors received approval. By faith, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive an inheritance. And he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith he received power and procreation, even though he was too old, and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners of the earth, for people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the homeland that they had left behind, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them.
I am excited more than you know about this current summer sermon series, where we kick off Faith in Fiction, Finding God Between the Lines. Rev Mark, Rev Jerry, and I will share some of our favorite books and explore how faith intersects with fiction, and perhaps even find new ways of understanding God and ourselves. So why faith in fiction? It has been said that reality is a pale shadow of fiction, a contrast where we, from a safe distance, can assume various identities in different circumstances across time and place without judgment. I have enjoyed reading fiction these days more than any other time in my life, mostly because of the St. Andrew Noon book group. I have read more fiction over the past 2 years at St. Andrew than I have in the prior 10 years, thanks to them. Usually my default is nonfiction, biographies, books about religious and spiritual thought, history, current events, and psychology. So fiction has become a refreshing delight. Now I read more for enjoyment and to expand my experiences rather than simply absorb knowledge. And for those nonfiction diehards, it should be noted that social science journal experts have concluded that reading fiction effectively enhances one's capacity to be unbiased when processing information, which broadens our imagination by transporting us into different worlds, thus liberating our minds into new imagined realities. This practice, no doubt, helps us in understanding new things, which can actually transfer into our actual lives and relationships. So perhaps there's an added benefit. Maybe we could all take on reading a little more fiction and see what happens. When Rev Jerry, Rev Mark, and I began discussing faith in fiction, it wasn't hard for me to think of a book. Immediately, I called dibs on John Irving's novel, A Prayer for Owen Meany. A Prayer for Owen Meany was first published in March 1989, and since then I have read it 3 times and listened to it once. From the very first line in John Irving's 7th novel, we are invited into the lives of Johnny Wheelwright and his best friend, Owen Meany. Friends growing up in a small New Hampshire town in the 1950s and 60s. Their lives are linked in inexplicable ways. A Prayer for Owen Meany is a coming-of-age story that involves life and death, war and grief, an honest exploration of faith and humanity, unwavering dedication to living life on the ready, to be ready to be an instrument of God with profound sense and purpose. I know that's a lot of big existential and theological stuff to cover in one book, and I find that A Prayer for Owen Meany is as deep as it is laugh out loud funny. It is probably not a book to listen to in the car with kids, but a book for adults to savor and take in slowly. The book opens with these words: I am doomed to remember a boy with a wrecked voice, not because of his voice, or because he was the smallest person I ever knew, or even because he was the instrument of my mother's death, but because he is the reason I believe in God. I am a Christian because of Owen Meany. What a great first line for a novel, though it spoils some major plot points. The first line reveals that this is a story about someone's life, a life that had a powerful impact, a life that was in itself a message. For a bit of context, if you haven't read the book, think of Owen Meany as the most unforgettable kid in any classroom. The one who looks out of place, and yet somehow he draws you in and you stare and you're not sure why, and you don't want to, but you do. Physically, Owen is tiny, apart from his very large ears. His bones are fragile, he barely grows, and other children can literally pass him around and do so during Sunday school. His voice, which you can't ignore, is an unearthly nasal tone that sounds like someone is stepping on a bicycle squeaker horn. In the novel, every word that Owen speaks is printed in capital letters to make sure that you hear it even on the page. Owen has a way about him. He is fiercely certain, with an ironclad conviction, that he is God's instrument, and that every event, no matter how small, fits into his fulfilling what God is calling him to do and be. Blunt and honest, Owen tells adults they're hypocrites, questions every priest and pastor in town mid-service, and puts Sunday school teachers to shame, and sometimes even makes them cry. Mischievous but principled, he stages these elaborate pranks, yet never out of cruelty. He sees them as more than just fun, but a way to teach others a moral lesson. With magnetic loyalty, the people who meet Owen are annoyed, intimidated, enchanted, or all three, but they never forget him. In this timeless story that never gets old, Owen drives almost every major event, shaping the narrator Johnny Wheelwright's life and faith. Owen could be seen as a prophet by some, calling out injustice, questioning a war, and forcing everyone around him, especially the righteous and pious church folks, to examine their beliefs and question what the essence of faith is. Real faith, that is. Throughout the book, there's also a mix-in of virgin birth rumors, prophetic dreams, and sacrificial overtones. Owen doesn't come across as preachy, but rather as the conscience and the voice of his community. He embodies the collusion of childlike wonder with adult responsibility and a wisdom beyond his years. Owen's unwavering sense of purpose raises some of the novel's biggest questions. Is destiny real? Can faith coexist with doubt? What really is a miracle? What does it mean to live as an instrument of God? Long after the plot details fade, most readers remember that voice in capital letters and the way a tiny boy made an enormous impact on his community and the world. Owen Meany is a pint-sized prophet with a piercing voice, an irritating level of certainty, and a heart so large it redefines everyone around him, likely including you once you've met him on the page. There is no doubt, however, that Owen is strange, different beyond just looks and voice, but really has a different way of seeing God, the world, and his own meaning and purpose. In our biblical text today, we hear about the quest for a homeland and the experiences of being a stranger, an alien, a refugee in the world. This is central to the calling of the faithful in Hebrews chapter 11, and maybe also where we find ourselves today as Christians living in a strange land that seems so far off from God's vision of a beloved community, where it can be hard to keep a vision of what's possible. This passage from Hebrews 11, verses 1 through 3 and 8 through 16 is often called the Pilgrim's passage. It defines faith as confidence in what we cannot yet see, then illustrates through Abraham, Sarah, and the other wanderers who died in faith, not having received the promises, but having believed. After briefly recounting the faithfulness of a long lineage of Jewish ancestors documented throughout the Old Testament, the author of Hebrews concludes by portraying all of these faithful individuals as having confessed that they too were strangers and foreigners on earth. The term strangers is derived from the Greek word associated with xenophobia, referring to individuals perceived as entirely distinct from the majority group. In essence, these faithful people, described by the author of Hebrews, lived with an awareness of their marginal status, perhaps even beyond the margins of their earthly experience. Their security was minimal, and even Abraham had to obtain a burial site for Sarah where they would be welcomed, or at least tolerated, in this new land. And despite his success in this place where he resided, the otherness remained ever apparent, even within Abraham. Now, John Irving never quotes these verses from Hebrews outright in a prayer for Owen Meany. However, the novel could be viewed as a contemporary midrash on this chapter in Hebrews. A midrash is understood in the Jewish tradition as a commentary of sorts, used to explain the simple meaning of the text, not in its historical context or even in the basis of fact, but rather to reveal deeper and often hidden meanings implied in the text. Layer by layer, the text of Hebrews functions as an interpretive key to Johnny and Owen. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Owen Meany is the walking definition of that line. He trusts an unseen belief of who he is, who God is, and who he is called to be so completely that Owen is even certain of his own date and manner of death. Owen's voice announces these indivisible realities with the certainty of physical fact. But his bestie, Johnny Wheelwright, the narrator, begins in the opposite place, churched but unbelieving. Over the 22-year friendship, Johnny is dragged, sometimes resentfully, toward exactly the Hebrews kind of faith, confidence without empirical proof. Without giving too much away, by the last chapter, Johnny, like the writer of Hebrews, prays not for evidence, but for intervention. Johnny says, if you have any influence with God, ask him to oblige. The novel's title, A Prayer for Owen Meany, echoes Hebrews' emphasis on faith, speaking into what is possible, yet still unrealized. Owen, however, repeatedly sets out with no guarantee beyond the inner call and living a life ready to be God's instrument when the time comes. Owen goes to military school, to ROTC, to the Army, and later to Arizona, which fulfills his calling. Johnny, the reluctant Abraham, follows. Each migration is a rehearsal for the last scene. Owen's promised land turns out to be a grim bathroom where Vietnamese refugee children must be saved because, as Owen noted, they desire and deserve better. The passage in Hebrews and A Prayer for Owen Meany should not be read or mistaken as a triptych for predestination, unquestioned destiny, but rather as a radical trust, a leap of faith that comes with saying yes to the next step, the next day, the next moment, and saying yes to God's creative and unfolding possibilities. Doubt itself can be a pilgrimage and is part of the journey, not the denial of it. Owen's certainty is a lived echo of that too. In short, Hebrews 11 offers a theological skeleton underneath a prayer for Owen Meany. The epistle's portrait of faith as forward-leaning trust, lived by migrant visionaries who never quite belong, is incarnated in Owen's unwavering sense of purpose and in Johnny's long doubt, disbelief, and grudging conversation. Read together, Hebrews makes Owen's eccentric certainty intelligible, while Owen Meany gives Hebrews 11 a modern, heartbreaking, capital letter voice. What makes Owen Meany extraordinary is not that God scripted each detail, but that Owen consistently chooses to respond to the call or the lure he senses from God. The lure being the divine lure and creative possibility available to us all. Owen's faith is real, earnest. Owen lives life with purpose, seeing himself not in an arrogant way as God's instrument, simply to be played, but rather as a conduit for God, ready and willing to respond when God calls. Johnny will write, in contrast, resist. Doubt, anger, political disillusionment are always present with Johnny and keeps Johnny from taking action. And yet, each time he remembers Owen, a divine, fresh possibility opens where he trusts a little more and begins to forgive. Owen Meany embodies that lure of God, a clarity of call, purpose, and meaning for his community. His unsettling honesty, his prank and prophecy tactics nudge everyone towards a more authentic life. As Christ is a definitive response to God, Owen is a miniature, time-bound echo of that responsiveness that you and I are also capable of living into. One where predestination or fatal determinism isn't set before us like a self-driving car that locks us in and we can't get out of, but rather a faith and life where God keeps extending a persistent invitation and miracles become less about mystery and more about our own cooperation with God's creative possibilities found in each and every life, each and every day, each and every moment. It should not be lost that the novel itself is a prayer. John Irving shares Johnny's written remembrance as more than a memoir, but rather a sustained act of prayer, a vision where prayer shifts from pleading for interventions that override personal choice and freedom to aligning oneself with the quiet, pervasive call of God, present in each moment, where we're all being ready and asked to respond. What we see in Owen Meany and in the legacy of our ancestors who have wandered also in strange lands, and certainly in Jesus, is not certainty about doctrines, but trust that every choice, even the tragic ones, can be gathered into God and creatively transformed. In essence, A Prayer for Owen Meany is less a story about an omnipotent puppeteer and rather about a boy who followed, and more of a testimony of what can happen when one tiny voice hears the lure of God clearly and keeps saying yes. Maybe you've wondered if your own life could have an impact on others. Have you read an obituary, visited a cemetery, read a biography about a historical figure, or attended a funeral lately? Did your thoughts turn to, what story is in my life? Will my life have mattered? Take a look or have a listen to A Prayer for Owen Meany, and then let's talk. Our takeaways for today are: predestination is nothing more than God's persistent invitation in our yes. Prayer is at the core of aligning oneself with the quiet, pervasive invitation of God present in every moment. In faith is not certainty about doctrines, but trust that our choices, even the tragic ones, can be gathered into God and creatively transformed. May it be so.